Arguably the most famous episode of the 2004 Battlestar Galactica TV series is one of its first. In 33, the relentless Cylons show up like clockwork to pursue Galactica, driving the crew to the breaking point. It was a brilliant concept for a TV show, and a very similar idea works quite well for Battlestar Galactica: Scattered Hopes. This roguelike strategy game about leading a small fleet on a quest to link up with Galactica immediately after the destruction of Caprica borrows that ticking clock and combines it with an unceasing barrage of both missiles and crises, giving a tense edge to its strategic resource management and relatively simple real-time tactical combat. If you haven't, it's definitely worth watching at least the first season of Battlestar Galactica before diving into Scattered Hopes, in part because it's a classic sci-fi show in its own right, but also because it'll help you understand a lot of the mechanics that separate this from similar games. In short, every faster-than-light jump you make kicks off a race against the turn-based clock. You have just 10 turns to not only repair and upgrade your ships and crew, but also collect resources and manage the political friction between different factions of survivors, as well as handle an intentionally overwhelming number of crisis situations before the Cylons arrive. At that point, you have to avoid taking too much damage for 2 real-time minutes while the FTL engines spin up again, and repeat. Even though you're playing as a smaller warship with a crew of literal randos rather than Galactica itself, using the eerie theme music from the show goes a long way to establishing the BSG vibe. The art direction also generally works toward that goal because while Scattered Hope's 16-bit style doesn't look as true to the show as 2017's Battlestar Galactica Deadlock did, it's at least interesting in its approach and serves it nearly as well as Scattered Hope's clear roguelike inspiration, the legendary FTL. The exception is when it zooms in on Cylon motherships at the beginning of each battle. That's kind of unflattering. These high-res portraits of your randomly generated crew that pop up during their frequent dialogue scenes are an eye-catching contrast though, and there's a lot of variety to them that I appreciated after a few runs. Combat sequences are a pretty straightforward real-time tactics game that you can pause at any moment to assign targets, use special abilities, and move your ships out of the way of missiles and other incoming attacks. These are relatively small-scale skirmishes, so you'll never have more than 5 fighters on the map. Usually it's more like 3. But you also have the weapons of your Gunstar battleship available to launch when you spot an opportunity to wipe out a group of clustered ships with a flak burst or a well-placed missile. One of my favorites allows you to detonate an enemy missile remotely, so you can set off Cylon nukes as they pass by their own ships. A fair amount of battlefield complexity emerges as your officers and fighters earn new traits from leveling up. Because these all stack together, you get to figure out how to optimize active and passive abilities like earning temporary speed boosts after a kill, bouncing ballistic weapons from one target to another, or reflecting damage back at attackers, among many other possibilities. On that note, I can't help be a little disappointed that Scattered Hopes doesn't really make any effort to replicate the show's flashy dogfighting. Next to the cinematic approach of something like Sins of a Solar Empire 2 or Homeworld 3, it does look a little lame to see these fighters behave like bumper cars. Though I can understand why having everything flying every which way might make the action tough to follow when there are a couple of dozen Cylon ships and nuclear missiles screaming toward your Gunstar and you simultaneously have to keep your ships out of the blast radius of your own area of effect attacks. So it's a trade-off I'm willing to accept. There isn't a huge amount of variety from battle to battle simply because Cylons rely heavily on a handful of ship types that mostly just jump in around the map and mindlessly charge at your capital ships unless your fighters draw them away with taunts or mess with their heads with abilities. You can count on plenty of easily swatted raiders and their heavier counterparts, backed by smaller numbers of artillery ships, missile launchers, stealth ships, hackers, mine layers, and the especially annoying and evasive dodgers. That predictability is the main thing that keeps it possible to fend off so many of them with just a few ships of your own. But there are at least a few meaningful differences between fights because each Cylon mothership you square off against gives its accompanying fighters certain bonuses and modifiers. And occasionally, battlefields will also be littered with devastating minefields to avoid or asteroids that provide defensive bonuses that you can use to your tactical advantage. In every battle though, you're always watching that 2-minute timer tick down until the moment you can safely jump, often getting out by the skin of your teeth while an enormous final wave of Cylon ships fires into the empty space your Gunstar and 2 civilian ships occupied just an instant before. That's a built-in tension that Scattered Hopes makes good repeated use of. If I may though, I've got to say that it's maddening that the auto-pause triggers when the clock counts down to 0 but not the instant your last fighter docks. That's almost always the moment I actually want to mash the jump button to avoid leaving anybody behind. I've found that the single biggest predictor of whether I'll have a good run or not is if I luck into recruiting several new crew members in the options I'm given in the first few jumps. Not only can these officers pilot fighters and man Gunstar weapon stations to boost their abilities, and the longer they're around the higher level they'll be by the end, Out of combat, they also give you at least one free action to resolve a situation or gather extra resources and better ships. That's absolutely invaluable early on because the benefits you get from not having to spend supplies snowball quickly. And sure, having more crew members makes it a little trickier to figure out which one of them is a Cylon saboteur, but not that hard. It's not a requirement because you can recover from having a small crew early on if you manage to rescue and upgrade civilian ships that automatically generate a ton of resources every jump, but nothing beats pure manpower for handling a crisis in my experience. It's never a surprise when a new crisis pops up since they're marked on that bottom right timeline, but they're usually inconvenient because you're probably already struggling to resolve the last one, or the last three. A lot of the problems that arise are one-offs that can be dealt with quickly, but plenty are strung together as fairly elaborate stories with multi-part resolutions that require your team to fix airlocks, repair damage, treat wounded civilians, arrest suspects, or even fight special battles before they're resolved and their negative effects are lifted. There are even personal quests that pay homage to Starbuck's Death Wish from the show or uncover characters' hidden pasts, unlocking powerful upgrades. That said, for a game that's meant to be played over and over again, it seems like there aren't quite enough of these to go around. I was only a couple of runs in before I was having to click through a bunch of dialogue I'd already read, and rushing to the decision at the end about which faction to please and who to raise tensions with. I've even gotten the same story event multiple times in a single run. Yes, one of the show's most quotable catchphrases is, "All of this has happened before and will happen again," but this is taking that a little bit too far. That's especially true of the hidden Cylon story that happens on every single run, except notably on the one where I accidentally got them killed before they were revealed. It's not really about deduction, but more of a process of elimination, as you're given clues every jump that highlight suspicious crew members, which you then have to guess at and spend resources to investigate until you get lucky. That part doesn't have as much intrigue as you'd probably hope, but the fact that there are two different ways the confrontation can play out based on whether the Cylon knows they're a Cylon or not is a fun twist, and there are some interesting decisions to be made in both outcomes. A run of Scattered Hopes takes a bit on the longer side for a roguelike, usually around 2 hours. There's an achievement for finishing in under 90 minutes, which should give you an idea of what a quick one is like. But that means your crew and ships get lots of opportunities to level up on the journey, and you gather progressively more randomized passive and active abilities that you get to mix and match based on whatever comes your way. One time I ended up with 4 powerful artillery ships that, thanks to stacked range bonuses, could fire across the entire map and completely dominated every late game battle. That was an easy win that felt great after getting kicked around for a while. Of course, it took me a while to get to the point where I was regularly winning. My first 6 runs ended in failure, largely because the Hades-style progression system withholds some pretty crucial abilities, like more starting resources, re-rolling random upgrade choices, restarting a failed battle, and increasing the odds of getting legendary quality items and traits. Once you unlock a fair number of those, victory becomes much more attainable. Though naturally, you'll also unlock new Gunstar variants that put more focus on castable weapons rather than fighters, and every successful run, as each of them unlocks a tougher version where things can go wrong that much faster. So even though I've already done 35 hours worth of runs, I haven't gotten anywhere near beating the toughest challenges. Battlestar Galactica Scattered Hopes tests how well you hold up under the pressure of command by forcing you to play a game of whack-a-mole against endless waves of Cylon attacks, political crises, and ethical dilemmas that threaten to tear your fleet apart from within, while you're simultaneously putting out both literal and metaphorical fires. Neither the pausable real-time combat nor the turn-based strategic management phases are about winning outright, so much as they are about escaping without taking too many losses and making the best of bad situations, and that keeps tensions high throughout. It's not visually spectacular, but it does have a style that feels true to the BSG series. And like any great roguelike, its random upgrades and ever-escalating challenge modifiers have no trouble justifying taking one more run even dozens of hours in, after you've seen each crisis story play out multiple times. For more on great roguelikes, check out our reviews of Slay the Spire 2 Early Access and Mugenics. And for everything else, stick with IGN.